All right, we're going to get going with the second panel of, I guess it's the third panel of the morning. I'm reminded that competition can be very uncomfortable for the participants in a competition because I need to follow Luigi as a moderator, and that is deeply uncomfortable for me. I'll be less entertaining, I'm afraid. This panel is not about the health of markets, it's about the health of democracy. Free speech is absolutely necessary to a healthy democracy. In our society, communication increasingly happens online, and it happens under the auspices of a small number of very large companies. The question we're going to talk about today is whether that reality threatens the health of free speech, whether it threatens the health of our democracy, and if so, what we should do about it. Doha made the case on the previous panel that the best way to address this kind of issue is to focus on increasing competition in the marketplace, and everything else will follow. We're mostly going to talk about, we're going to begin from the premise that maybe that's not good enough, and we've got several panelists who are going to talk about why they think we need to do more than that, and then one panelist who's going to offer remarks to the contrary. So we've got Gilad Edelman, who's a senior writer at Wired Magazine, Francis Fukuyama, a senior fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, Ellen Goodman of Rutgers Law School, and Derek Goldman of Santa Clara University's School of Law. And Ellen is going to kick us off.
Thank you. Slides? I don't know who's controlling that. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit of table setting for the panel. So I'm hoping I can have a few extra minutes to do that. Next slide, please. So we've been living in the world that social media made for only about 12 years, starting with the technical affordances that created virality, the share and retweet buttons. And I've sort of ended the timeline in 2021 with Frances Hogan's revelations, which publicized what many of us in this room had already been reporting on, that the problems that society was experiencing were endemic to algorithmic recommender systems and the engagement business model. Next slide.
They're there too, by the
Yes.
way.
So there's a lot we know and that we don't know about the magnitude of these problems. Partly we don't know things because of the data lacunae that were talked about yesterday, and partly just because media effects and communications harms are very hard to study and always have been. We do know that there are harms, and different political constituencies will focus on different ones of these. I'll just mention a few. One is silencing, either through content removals or the chilling of speech because of fear of mob attack. The third one up here is what I'm calling epistemic erosion that happens because of mis and disinformation, and also because of the financial and data intermediation of disintermediation of news organizations, especially smaller local ones, from their audiences, otherwise known as the death of local journalism, although I was happy to hear that the number of State House reporters has bounced back a little bit, in part because of the Knight Foundation and other foundations investing in that sector. Okay, and then the final harm that there seems to be most bipartisan sort of support for addressing is the ramifications for children. Next slide. Mindful, the rest of my talk will be about the policy space and the interventions in relation to these harms, and I'm sort of mindful always of Larry Lessig's model that law is only one regulator here and works in concert, and we should think of it as serving as a prompt for other more agile and sustainable changes. Next slide. So, in thinking about the regulation of platforms, we have to hold two ideas simultaneously. One is that platforms are just media systems with the characteristics of other communication systems that have justified regulation. So you'll remember in 2016 there was this debate with policymakers and commentators demanding that Mark Zuckerberg admit that he's a media company, he's running a media company, and his resistance to that. And I think we're sort of beyond that, and we see that these are media systems with scarcities, with externalities, and with a lot of concentration. Next slide. On the other hand, they're very different from any kind of media or communications company that has been regulated in the past. So algorithms make them different. Data asymmetries, both with respect to users and with respect to competitors and the other side of the two-sided market, advertisers, make them very different. The word convergence up here I'm using pointedly because the last piece of major telecommunications legislation we had was in 1996, and that was trying to deal with convergence of telecoms technologies, meaning telephone, cable, broadcasting. So digital tech is next level convergence, particularly because of you've got sort of, to the extent we think of platforms as being speakers, having editorial policies, being media companies. We've got sort of that element, and that is converging with user content. Not to mention the fact that they are global, and what Anu Bradford calls the Brussels effect here may mean that US regulation doesn't even matter very much. So in addition to the difficulty of finding the right regulatory model, there are other difficulties in this space. We're talking sort of often about Facebook and Meta, which is kind of, limited because if we look at the DSA, it probably won't take, if it's passed, it won't take effect until 2023, when Meta may be a quickly diminishing part of our ecosystem. So who knows what online harms will look like in the future. The US in particular has little regulatory infrastructure to implement any of the ideas that have been proposed. So unlike in Europe, where there are privacy regulators, where the telecommunications regulators have much broader jurisdiction than the FCC has, and also the DSA proposes to set up a new regulatory regime, none of that exists in the US. Also, there are serious speech interests implicated. And then finally, and I think to me most importantly in some respects, when we're talking about digital platforms, they are and will be much more so integrated into other algorithmic systems. And so the object of regulation, the object of concern is shifting. And so we need to think about sort of broader problems of trust and accountability through all algorithmic systems when we talk about platforms. Next slide. Okay, so very quickly, the palette of regulatory, the menu of regulatory options. Two main tracks, and this has always been true in media and telecommunications regulation. There's structural regulation, which most of this conference has been focused on, and then there are systems regulation. Next slide. Many proposals in both of these buckets have been propounded, including here at this conference 3 years ago under Guy Rolnick's leadership. We had a big paper that had a whole bunch of ideas and have since been followed up by me and by many others. And some of these ideas are in the DSA. Some of them are languishing in draft bills in Washington. Okay, so I'm not going to talk much about structural regulation. I think Professor Fukuyama has a structural regulation idea. Next slide. I am going to talk about systemic regulation. So these include these are a family of interventions that take industry structure largely as it is and seek to influence product design, behavior, and transparency. And we see many of these again in the DSA, and former President Obama just endorsed some of them in his Stanford speech yesterday. Next slide. Okay, so what I mean to signify by the red bubbles there is that these have particularly troublesome free speech implications attached to them. And so we need to be very careful with interventions on the left side of the slide. These entanglements with free speech protections are much less salient on the right side. And so these interventions, here we're talking about data access, transparency, product design, codes of conduct, depending on whether they're enforceable by the government, then they do implicate free speech concerns. If they're just self-regulatory, much less so. So these are largely content-neutral interventions. And I think they have three main benefits. One is that they're more responsive to the fact that the harms that we're talking about stem from design problems, not from content problems. Two, as I said, they don't implicate the First Amendment very much, if at all. And third, they are technology neutral and can apply more broadly to algorithmic systems. And for that reason, they're more forward-looking and can tolerate more and more thoroughgoing convergence in the future. Okay, so for the remainder of my time, I've sort of talked about how to regulate. I want to talk about why to regulate. And so the why is to ensure that American communication systems reflect the political commitment to democracy. And this is not a novel or a hipster notion of regulation. This is the tradition of US media policies from the start. It's instantiated in the First Amendment, in the design of the postal and broadcasting systems, and early internet law. And then it stopped. And so that's where I want to pick up. These laws, next slide. These laws and structures that I mentioned reflected views embedded in both Madisonian and Jeffersonian schools of thought, sometimes in tension with each other. So one is that a sprawling democracy requires centripetal forces, a communication system that knits the nation together, that supports efforts to build solidarity, and a center that will hold. The other is the insistence on centrifugal forces and an antipathy to concentrated power. And I just want to say that, before the internet, these different notions found homes in different kinds of regulation for different kinds of platforms, which was something that Lee Bollinger pointed out, that you had sort of Madisonian kinds of regulation and Jeffersonian kinds of regulation. Digital has flattened all of this and created sort of a monoculture, one sort of business model for communications that is unregulated. So what would it mean to bring back these Madisonian and Jeffersonian notions? I'll just mention two ideas. So some of the platform harms that I identified are the harms of faction. So I've proposed as a matter of soft law, this is not really amenable to hard law for reasons that I think Eric might talk about. But soft law, shaping norms and the market, there ought to be more friction in these systems. Some of the ideas here are a circuit breaker to disrupt virality, which President Obama endorsed yesterday, very exciting. Limits on sharing, prompts to create more deliberation, amplification of credible sources, and platform design to create more common exposure to content. Next slide. That's the Madisonian side. The Jeffersonian side is interventions, and these interventions I think are more conducive to hard law interventions, are rules on data protection for users to give users more autonomy and control over their data, data access for competitors and the public, which we talked about a lot yesterday, and transparency about algorithmic processes. And this is my final slide, which you can barely read. So even as we consider the special place of communication systems in a democracy, we should also be thinking about general regulation for algorithmic systems. So these would be, transparency requirements, auditability, de-risking, and fair business practices. And that's it.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't have slides, but I have a little demo that I want to run towards the end of my presentation. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm not a lawyer or an economist. I'm a political scientist. So I'm a little bit of a fish out of water. But I do think that the point that was brought up in the last panel about the harms to democracy are among the most important that are addressed by the question of concentration, particularly on the part of these big internet platforms. In 2020, I was running a Stanford working group. It started out as a Stanford working group on antitrust. But as we started talking about the problem, we came to the quick realization, well, two realizations. First, that the political harms that were posed by large platforms was really what people were the most worried about in many respects. And then secondly, there's such a huge body of thought and scholarship and precedent regarding the economic harms. That's what all the antitrust lawyers and economists think about. We didn't think we could add to that discussion much, but we could add a little bit to the question of what was the problem for democracy. And here I think that we thought very carefully about the underlying problem. And one of the things that the underlying problem is, so if you ask many people, what's the problem that's posed by the platforms, they'd say things like the propagation of fake news, conspiracy theories, hate speech, all of the toxic content that everybody knows is out there. Some of it amplified by foreigners, but a lot of it done domestically. In my view, however, that's not the really central problem. And it can't be the central problem because in the United States we have this thing called the First Amendment. Under the First Amendment, it is not illegal or unconstitutional to propagate fake news. It is not unconstitutional to propagate hate speech. And in fact, all of that kind of speech is protected. The real harm has to do with either amplification or silencing on a very large scale. This can be done by the government, and that's why the First Amendment appropriately focuses on government action, and it prohibits the government from putting limits on free speech. But it is something that can also be done by the platforms, and a lot of people say, well, the platforms are protected by the free speech because they can they can curate the content that they carry. That's true, but I think in terms of the effects on political discourse, that's a very, very great power. And so what we want to do through policy is to reduce that power. And there's several ways of doing it. I guess the other big problem with the platforms is that they have taken to moderating content, but they do it in a way that is completely non-transparent and that does not give individual users any control over the kind of content that they see. And so if you take the problem as that power of amplification or silencing, you've got to come up with solutions on how to control it. What we have the choice we've taken up till now is basically to delegate that power to the platforms themselves and put a lot of political pressure on them to remove hate speech, remove Donald Trump, remove conspiracy theories, and the like. And for both normative and practical political reasons, I do not think this is an appropriate solution. I do not think that the platforms have either the capacity, the judgment, or the legitimacy to be the arbiters of what is appropriate political speech in any modern democracy. The analogy I would come up with is that power to mediate content or to curate content is like a loaded gun. It's like a loaded gun that's sitting on the table, and you are trusting the guy at the other end of the table not to pick the gun up and to shoot you. And at the moment, if you're on the more progressive side of the political spectrum, you're not unhappy with that situation because, Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or the people sitting on the other side are not, in your view, terrible, crazy people. But I think the threat of Elon Musk taking over Twitter illustrates what the problem is. You may not have somebody that you particularly agree with running one of these companies in the future. What if a Rupert Murdoch or a Julian Sinclair Smith ends up buying Meta or a similar kind of platform? And if you are designing a good democratic institution, it should not depend on the particular political identity of the current power holders. What you want is an institution that is neutral with regard to who's sitting on the other side of the table. And for that reason, I think the current system of delegating to private for-profit companies is not a long-term sustainable solution. I'm just going to run through some other potential solutions, and I'm going to tell you what the solution that we came up with is. Antitrust. So I agree, if you could actually implement a structural rule in antitrust so that these platforms were broken up into 6 platforms instead of 2 or 3 as we have currently, that would be a big improvement. I just don't think it's going to work for a whole variety of reasons. Antitrust law is really not focused on political harms. I think we saw that in the last panel. And in any event, even if it were, it's going to take 10 years before you could get any movement in this direction, and I don't see the political will to do that. I would say something similar about regulation. Now, it is not the case that we can't regulate media in this country. The Federal Communications Commission had something called the Fairness Doctrine back in the 1950s and 60s when you had 3 over-the-air broadcast networks whose dominance of media was somewhat comparable to the platform's dominance. And in the late 1960s, the Supreme Court actually said that the Fairness Doctrine was compatible with the Constitution in something called the Red Lion case. Republicans hated this, and the FCC rescinded that rule in the 1980s. The Democrats kept trying to bring it back. Republicans kept vetoing it and preventing that. And I just think if you look at the polarization in the United States today on important issues like should Donald Trump be allowed back on Twitter, there's no consensus on that view. You know, everybody thinks that the government ought to do something, but what the government should do is completely dependent on which side of the divide you are. So I don't think that that's a way going forward. Privacy policy could be used to limit the power of the platforms, that you can't use data generated in one sector to help you sell advertising in another sector. But I think, as was mentioned in one of the panels yesterday, in a way that locks in the advantages of the big platforms because of compliance costs. You got interoperability. Again, I think there are a lot of technical reasons why that's not going to work. So, if we can get this thing going now. So we have an idea that we've labeled middleware. And the basic idea is it is a way of inserting competition into the function of content curation. But it's not based on a breaking up of the big platforms. It keeps the platforms in place. Basic idea is that you will outsource content moderation to a layer of competitive middleware companies, and you will be able to choose the kind of content moderation that you want. And so, for example, if you're a consortium of universities, you want your faculty and students to rely to have reliable, credible data sources to look at, they could create a nonprofit that would produce middleware that would be mandated for the use of faculty members and so forth. If you wanted to only buy American, on Amazon, you could have a middleware company that would direct you to that. And in general, it would, if you could imagine a world in which that function was outsourced to a large number of third parties, then you would restore competition in this vital area of what it is that people see on the internet. There's a lot of advantages to that. It leaves the platforms alone, and it avoids this huge political obstacle of dealing with their political power, which would be involved in actually a structural breakup of them. And I think it could be implemented relatively quickly because it actually doesn't necessarily favor one side of the political division over another. And I could imagine getting political agreement on something like this much more readily than on a regulatory scheme. Let me just give you a short demonstration of what this might look like. So this was this demo was done by Ashish Goel, who's a computer scientist at Stanford, and a bunch of his students, just to illustrate what middleware would look like. So this is middleware on Twitter. Let's see. And it would obviously look different for different platforms, but so when you signed up for a platform, you would be given a choice of middleware providers. In this case, we've only got two ones that are working, the top two, the New York Times and the Heritage Foundation. All right, so you're scrolling down your Twitter feed, and I picked the New York Times, no, I'm sorry, I picked the Heritage Foundation middleware. And so in front of every tweet, you have various comments about how important it is, whether it is opinion, and the like. If you click on one of the buttons, you actually get the source of this. The square buttons are ones that actually have been generated by a third-party AI program. This is one of the things we wanted to experiment with in the demo, because obviously a middleware company couldn't go through every tweet that was put out, on Twitter and make a customized judgment. And so these actually come from an existing service that a middleware company could make use of. The ones with the round edges are actually ones that were inserted manually. And so you don't like the Heritage Foundation? So you switch over to the New York Times and you get a different set of labels on it. And there's some in which switching middleware providers actually then will block the, let's see, will actually block the content. And so if you want to read something that has been blocked, you just hit the also read. I'm not sure, this isn't working quite right. I didn't design the system, so I'm not completely familiar with its working. But the point is that it gives you some idea of the ability to choose different kinds of political filters and to apply them. Now, let me just conclude by saying there's two big problems that we see with this, this model. The one that is always brought up in discussions like this is that middleware is simply going to reinforce the filter bubbles that exist on the internet, because for every kind of university, middleware company that's giving you credible news, you'll get some right-wing, crazy middleware company that will direct you only to toxic content or conspiracy theories, and that's correct. It will do that. And you can expect that kind of filter to exist. However, the First Amendment, I think, prevents us from saying that the object should be simply to get rid of that content, as opposed to preventing it from being spread much more widely by these large platforms. The second problem is with the business model. If this was such a great idea, why doesn't middleware exist already? There are actually some firms that are trying to do this. There's a firm called NewsGuard that provides this kind of content ranking. But right now, there's not a clear road to profitability, and I think you would probably have to combine this idea with some form of regulation in order to generate the kinds of revenues, kind of share the ad revenue from some of the existing platforms, and you can only do that, I think, by having Congress mandate that that sort of thing happen. But this is basically the idea. It's one of the ways that I think we can move forward, and I think it's the one I prefer simply because it is injecting a little bit of competition and consumer choice into what is probably the most critical information market for American and global democracy. Thanks.
So I think I'm mostly going to talk about one of the circles from one of Ellen's charts, which is norms, which might be frustrating because it's not policy and it's not law. I think I want to suggest that there's a missing character in a lot of these discussions, which is the media. And I think that the role of the media in this conversation about social media is important. And so I want to talk about that in three ways, which I hope there's a logic to them, but I can't guarantee it. So one, I think a lot of the hand-wringing and debate around misinformation, one reason that it's often kind of unsatisfying is that the term misinformation is a way of dancing around what a lot of people often really mean, which is right-wing propaganda, right-wing media. And so, because it's you know, there's the idea that what's at stake is just the prevalence of things that are factually inaccurate is sort of fanciful. And Facebook in particular, this has been well documented over the years, is basically a distribution turbocharger for unscrupulous right-wing media, many outlets that really wouldn't exist without Facebook providing an incredible business model where you can very cheaply reach tons of people, and it's very easy to game with outrage, or what one Facebook, or more than one Facebook research document refers to as hate bait. And this is well documented in the Facebook files that people inside the company are always bringing this up, and then usually getting shot down by Joel Kaplan, who worries that they would alienate conservative users. So my point here is not that liberal is good and conservative is bad. My point is that there just is an asymmetry when it comes to professional and ethical journalistic operations in this country, and I think it's uncontroversial that democracy benefits from, and in fact depends on, a well-functioning free press that subscribes to pro-democratic norms. Which brings me to my next point, which is that social media needs to develop a set of professional and institutional norms. And again, I think about how things work in the media, where reputable news organizations obey all kinds of internal rules, codes of ethics, commitments to accuracy and fairness, and fact gathering, and all kinds of things. And guess what? Congress didn't make us do it. Congress couldn't make us do it, right? Because of the First Amendment. And yet, I think most people would agree that it's really important to have media that is trustworthy and has a commitment to accuracy and fairness. And obviously, the media is super messed up, and nobody does this perfectly, and a lot of people don't even try. But at least these are the standards. Even people who hate the media, what do they say? It's biased. They're inaccurate. They're unfair. In other words, they're using standards developed by the media to criticize the media, and that's a good thing. It's good to have public commitments that critics can use to hold you accountable. And social media does not have its version. Oh, sorry. Another important one is the separation between business and editorial. The firewall between, you don't have the person selling ads telling you what articles to write. At least you shouldn't. And the Times certainly doesn't, and the Wall Street Journal certainly doesn't. And social media does not have an analogous set of norms. The basic norm of social media is let's let some AI figure out what people want to click on and look at, and then let's do a bunch of kludgy stuff on the back end to try to clean up the mess when that inevitably goes wrong. And that's bad, and it's unsophisticated, and it's completely agnostic on the question of what this does to democracy or to any other external values. And if you take Facebook's, this is legible even in mission statements. Facebook's mission statement is to make the world more connected. That's completely vacuous. Twitter's, I was looking earlier, but I don't have it memorized, to give everyone the power to create and share ideas and information instantly without barriers. That sounds a little better, but note that it implies that what you want is no barriers, no friction, no institutional norms, nothing collective, and I would argue that ethos is part of the problem here. So, I mean, what could these norms look like? I'm not going to try to enumerate what they would be, partly because I haven't worked them all out, but an obvious one is the business editorial firewall. That's something that comes up again and again with reporting on Facebook, that decisions about content policy are made by members of the public policy team, which would be sort of like somebody telling a reporter what to write about because they're worried about how it's going to play with their advertisers. And I think that the good news is that I do think that policy levers can help nudge this along. It's never something that government can force, But I do think that introducing more competition, more portability and switchability, certainly requiring transparency so that people, regulators and the public actually know what is going on and what values are being coded into these recommender systems. I think it's very clear that even companies with major market power still care. They still are somewhat responsive to public opinion. So making it easier to hold them accountable, I think, could nudge these kinds of things along. But the frustrating thing is that I don't have a model bill that's going to just bring this into being. I'll just conclude by saying that media also we need to improve, we being journalists, need to improve our norms as we relate to social media. How many people here regularly use Twitter? So, how many people are on Twitter right now? Matt? Where is he? That's really weird. There's like Twitter has generously 40 million daily active users in the United States. That's like 14% of adults. So I think there's like 50 people in here. So 7 hands. Sorry, one more time. How many hands went up? You use Twitter regularly? So it should be 7, but it's not. It's like 45. It's
called sample selection.
See, I do know stats. So that's weird, and it's important because this gets at why we can't conceive of all this as market power or competition or antitrust problems, because Twitter's a small company relative to the tech giants in terms of revenue and in terms of users, and yet it is unquestionably very influential. And this is why. It's because people like, elites, whatever, media, academics, policymakers, and the people who pay attention, who they pay attention to, disproportionately, wildly so, are on Twitter, to the point where even though Twitter doesn't have anything you'd call market power, even though most of the public isn't on it, in some important way, being denied access to Twitter is a kind of civil death. If you want to participate in public debate and participate in a crucial part of democratic self-governance, being denied Twitter is an absolutely crucial tool, and it is that way basically because I would argue that we in the media have conferred upon it this awful agenda-setting power, which has all these negative consequences that I won't list them all, but briefly, it really warps people's senses of reality and sense of what public opinion is, and it really shapes what views get injected into politics and to government in really unhealthy ways. And it's also just insane to spend hours of your job digging around on a social media site, and yet we do. So I would just conclude that, like, media as speaking of norms, institutional norms, one thing that I hope happens in my line of work is that we get a little bit more sophisticated about letting this, for-profit company, this tool that they built, sort of like giving it all this power to drive what we do.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for putting this event together and for giving me the opportunity to participate. I always find it odd to talk about free speech topics in an antitrust conference. There's kind of this intrinsic clash in my mind about the agendas of antitrust and the agendas that we have in the debates that I normally participate in regarding free speech. So I'm going to emphasize the free speech part of this as opposed to the antitrust part. And I'm going to just open with really 2 remarks or 2 broad points. The first is about the nature of content moderation. We've already heard content moderation is an integral part of the competitive environment in internet discourse. And yet, content moderation is what I call a zero-sum game. Every time that a item is moderated or not, somebody got what they wanted and someone didn't get what they wanted. And zero-sum games by nature don't lend themselves to good compromises. It's not like we can feel like everyone's going to be happy with the outcomes of zero-sum games. In fact, we can predict reliably that whoever didn't get what they wanted is going to be unhappy with the outcome, and might very well question the legitimacy of the process by which the decision was made, even if the process was legitimate, because they don't like the outcome. And it's that intrinsic nature of content moderation as a zero-sum game that makes the problems fundamentally intractable. I feel like at many of the conferences I go to, or many of the conversations online, I feel like we're all chasing this platonic ideal of content moderation. All we need is a new entrant who's going to come up with the perfect solution, and then we'll get it right. We don't have that competitive player today, but they're out there, and we just need them to emerge, and they're not coming. There will never be the emergence of someone who will do content moderation in a way that we will all say, that's the right answer. And part of that also reflects the fact that we don't even agree what we want. There's such deep schisms about what we think is the appropriate kind of discourse, both online and offline, that it's not possible for us to ever agree that that any service ever did it right. Things like the idea of having competition in content moderation, I actually think there's some promise to that. I don't know if you can get there regulatorily, but we already know that there's voluntary efforts to do that. Twitter has a program called Blue Sky designed to do exactly that, to allow the distribution of content so everyone can pick their own filters for how they manage it. So maybe we can get there somewhere like that, but notice that that solution only works once we give up the idea that there's one right answer for everybody. And we recognize that we'll never all agree about the scope of content moderation being done properly. The other thing I want to point out, and this is, I think, really the problems that we were discussing in the first panel about antitrust, and it just comes up over and over again. The real secret here is that everything that takes place when it comes to content moderation, regulation, and enforcement at this point is partisan. It's about partisan politics. And once the partisan politics takes over the conversation, there's never going to be a satisfactory solution because by definition, the partisans don't agree with each other. And so we have to think about how do we harden our systems to prevent partisan politics from dictating how we talk to each other online. Because that's where we're going, and I'm going to give us some examples in a moment, but I just can't stress enough. When we have partisan politics dominating the conversation, it's not just that the tribe wants to win, they want their opponent tribe to lose. And so much of what we're seeing in the regulatory and enforcement sphere is really just about that. How do I get my rival tribe to lose? I was shocked and horrified to see that Florida convened a special session this week to punish a major employer in Florida for their constitutionally protected speech. That's the agenda that's driving the regulatory efforts in states across the country, is to how do we punish our opponents? That's what the legislature is working on. So if we think that any of the regulatory options that we're going to discuss in this panel or anywhere else is going to avoid that partisan trap, I think we're deluding ourselves. And we have to then put a filter on, okay, if we're going to adopt this regulation, let's adopt it with the idea it's going to be weaponized by someone who's doing a partisan deployment solely to get at their opponent and make their opponent's life more miserable. That's the agenda. If that's the agenda, are we prepared for that in our country? And this is not hypothetical when it comes to content moderation. We saw this in Texas and Florida. Both of them adopted bills last year that told internet services how they had to manage content. And that was done as a retaliatory measure against the internet services to basically do exactly to them what Florida did this week to Disney, is to say, we're going to tell you how we want you to do things. And I can't stress enough the enforcement piece of this. And so we were talking about that in the last panel, for example. We just need better enforcement laws, and I agree with that. However, you should assume that the enforcement of those laws that relate to content moderation will be enforced selectively, solely on a partisan basis. And we are seeing that. We are seeing that, for example, with an investigation that Paxton in Texas has launched against Twitter, which was done on an unambiguously retaliatory basis because Twitter deplatformed Trump. And so Paxton said, I'm going to make Twitter pay, and I'm going to use the existing laws that I have in order to punish them. And so that's actually ongoing today. That's a current live dispute going on. What's going on with the laws that have been adopted? They're being weaponized on a partisan basis. Last thing I'll say in my introductory remarks is that if the Republicans take over Congress in the next elections, this will be their #1 agenda. This will the governance of speech will be their #1 agenda, and they will deploy their mechanisms in Congress to advance their partisan agendas. And so this is really, I think, the cutting edge frontier of the regulations today is, are we prepared for Congress to adopt laws on a partisan basis that will be enforced on a partisan basis? Because that's actually our future in a couple of months. So you can tell I'm scared for the future of the internet. And to me, the antitrust framing actually, I think, detracts from what's really going on here. This is not about competition. It's about partisanship. Thank you.
All right. Ellen, I want to start with you. You put up this slide in which you showed the types of moderation that are the types of regulation that are potentially problematic. It was very striking to me because it's a slide of the types of regulation that I am subject to as a member of the mainstream traditional media. So why are those rules problematic when it comes to the internet? Why can't we do online what we do in our traditional spaces?
Are you talking about liability? Because I think that's the only rule you're subject to.
Well, I'm subject to liability rules. As a publisher, we can be sued for libel, obviously. We can be sued for defamation.
Right.
We also have responsibility for the content, to moderate the content that we post. We can't simply hide behind the idea that we didn't see it before we put it on our site.
Right. To the extent that there's underlying liability for that content, you would be liable, and platforms are not. And so this is the Section 230 debate. And I think the big difference is that you are not principally distributing third-party content. You're principally distributing and user-generated content. You're principally distributing content that you are responsible for, that you are commissioning and writing, right? So that was what was decided in '96, was that in order to have the flourishing of this kind of third-party content and platforms, we have to give platforms immunity from liability for that. I think this has become a bit of a red herring because most of the harms we're talking about, even if there were liability for platforms, it would not cover most of this because there is defamation, there is online defamation. There are Alex Jones situations. So Alex Jones was found liable for defamation, and the platforms that ran him, were immune. So there are those situations, but mostly the disinformation, the harm for children, the radicalization, unless it's really classified as promotion of terrorism, there's no underlying liability for any of that. And so making the platforms, opening them up to liability, I don't think would do anything, although it would make them it would chill them, which depending on how Eric would think that's bad and other people might like that. So I think the 230 debate is a bit of a red herring. I do think that the proposal that Obama endorsed yesterday about maybe tweaking 230 so that there is some responsibility for ads, which platforms are in charge of, does make some sense.
Eric, it struck me that both Ellen and Frank were talking about not what you describe as impossible, but as a way of working past what you describe as impossible. They're both talking about proposals for introducing transparency or choice into the marketplace, not to have anyone deciding what is or isn't acceptable as content, but providing people with the tools to make their own decisions about that. What is wrong with those models?
So in general, transparency is great, and we all support it. We always prefer more information rather than less. So there's, that's feels like low-hanging fruit. I do want to note that transparency in the internet context as it's being proposed is a relatively novel solution. We actually do not have many good examples from the offline world where we forced editorial publishers to explain what they're doing, to justify it, and to provide statistics about what they're doing. This is actually what I would call a novel solution. And so I have a paper that explains why I think this is potentially problematic. And I'm going to mention a couple of pieces. First of all, I will point out that both Texas and Florida, the laws that I mentioned, include multiple transparency pieces. But that should scare you because those were bundled together in a partisan effort to try to advance the agendas of the sponsors. So the fact they think that that's a good idea should start to make you wonder, what are they going to do with it? And I think that really gets down to the questions about enforcement. We can have rules about transparency, but who enforces those rules and how are they going to enforce it? So I go back to things like the lawsuit I mentioned where, or the investigation that Paxson has launched against Twitter. He didn't launch that investigation to do good, to fix a consumer protection problem. He launched it as a retaliatory effort for a political, a moderation decision that he politically opposed. And so the transparency rules that might be proposed, you should assume will be enforced on the same partisan basis. That whoever is in charge of the enforcement will say, I'm going to go use these transparency rules to get disclosure of everything that you have said about your moderation decisions, and I'm going to find the things that I think will advance my partisan agenda. That's exactly what Paxson is doing today. And what's remarkable to me about that is he's getting away with it. The courts have not been able to throw that case out and stop him from his investigation. So he's got this just ongoing investigation saying, keep telling, to Twitter, saying, keep telling me everything you're doing. Give me that transparency, but give it to me so I can cherry pick out the things that I think I can use for a partisan agenda.
Well, I don't know that case well at all, but I think that Eric makes a valuable point here about you do need to think about how to, like, if you think about a proposal, okay, now think about the worst person you know using it. However, taken to its extreme, that's just an argument against having laws. I mean, name a law, someone has abused it. Someone in power has abused it for political reasons. And I also think that we want to be careful about guilt by association. I think you need to evaluate the transparency proposals on their own merits because a lot of these bills are kind of grab bags, and there's going to be stuff that is horrifying, and there might be stuff that makes sense in isolation. It's not like it's tainted by its proximity to something that is indefensible. And I do wonder, though, again, I don't know the Texas case well, or at all, actually, to be honest, even though it's presumably what I should cover. I mean, it would seem to me that if there were some kind of broadly applicable transparency regime that would kind of take this move off the table. I mean, you wouldn't be hauling a company into court to try to pry out secrets because the relevant things wouldn't be secret. And also, I also thought it was interesting, your point about that we've never tried this transparency stuff is an important one. Like a lot of this debate just takes place in an imaginary realm because our regulatory landscape is so impoverished and because this is such a new, relatively new domain. I wouldn't say, you compared transparency in social media to traditional media. I would just point out that I think the reason we're even talking about transparency is because what's in the New York Times just is transparent. It's the same issue. Everybody sees the same thing. And just to orient the group here, the reason we're even talking so much about transparency, which sounds like an eat your vegetables kind of thing, is because there's just a very fundamental level at which what's new and troubling about social platforms is that who sees what is just a mystery.
And I want to jump on that point, Frank, because I'm amused by the idea of a New York Times filter, because the New York Times is a filter. And we're reasonably successful. We have 10 million subscribers now or something, but it turns out that most Americans don't want to use it. They would prefer to use Facebook to get their information. So what makes you think that even if we subsidized middlemen, that they would effectively make a dent on that problem?
Well, part of the idea here is not that a lot of red state conservatives are then going to sign up for the New York Times middleware company. They're not going to do that, right? But what it will do is give people back a little bit of agency in terms of being able to determine the algorithms, not the algorithms, but what they actually see, the content in their social media feeds. The reason that, this movement starts with the demand for transparency on the part of the platforms. And somebody mentioned that there's already some experimentation at Twitter so that you can modify, what comes up in your feed and this sort of thing. I don't think that that's really adequate because, first of all, the platforms shouldn't be the ones giving you the choice. And I think the transparency without a mechanism for people acting on it is really not going to be very useful. I actually came at this issue out of sort of the development field where you're dealing with, anti-corruption initiatives, and transparency, 10, 15 years ago was the solution to the problem. It turns out that it actually doesn't do a whole lot because a lot of people see that, their defense minister is stealing $100 million and, they just, they can't, get rid of this guy for a whole variety of reasons. And I think that simply making the algorithms transparent on the platforms is not going to be enough. So you need agency in terms of people being able to determine what they see, and the people that will want the New York Times filter, will be those who want somebody passing judgment on the stuff that has been coming across their feed that, whose provenance they don't know. So they hear some outlandish story and they say, well, is this really correct? And if you had the New York Times filter, they could actually see, this is actually pretty sketchy information.
But I mean, I have the sense that when people talk about the problem that we're experiencing as a society, the primary problem is not that there are people who would like to exercise better judgment about the content that they see and they need the tools to do it. The problem is that there are people who are just absorbing a stream of content without particular discrimination, indifferently almost, and there are other people who think that we should be pumping a different kind of content into their veins.
Yeah, that's true. I do think that the middleware idea will help a little bit, with that. I mean, the case that I think about is the spread of QAnon conspiracy theories among, moms in yoga classes, because it turned out that there was some, yoga guru that actually got into QAnon, and the algorithm on the platform, because he was retweeting a lot of QAnon content, a lot of these yoga moms just started getting QAnon stuff showing up in their feeds. And it does seem to me conceivable that you can have a filter that would be, applied by people that, let's say, want to have more reliable information, that would pop up a little warning sign that said, this is really pretty questionable kind of material. So I do think that there is, some reason to think that people would want to know what other people think about the quality of the information. The other thing, it may not have come through in that demo, but one of the neat things about that particular approach is that you can have multiple filters, and you can click on the different buttons, and you can actually see what, people with different viewpoints than your own actually think about the same piece of information. Given the polarization, there are probably not a whole lot of people that are too open to other ideas, but it does give a little bit extra information as to credibility, sources, and that sort of thing.
Ellen, I want to bring you back in, and I want to ask you about the role of competition in all of this, because people have more choices than they've ever had before about where to get information. And so on some very basic level, it seems like competition is serving its purpose. And yet, your diagnosis is that we need to come in and regulate. So why isn't competition good enough, basically?
Well, so it depends at what layer of the stack you're talking about, right? So there are lots of content sources, but there's not a lot of competition in the delivery mechanism or in the model that is the content moderation models, or the, I like to think of it as sort of salience models.
The recommender system.
The recommender systems, yeah, and the business model that fuels them. And so the business model it's an engagement business model, and it's also one of sort of relying on revealed preferences, right? It's like people want this junk in their veins. And I think actually that's not true. I don't think people actually want this junk in their veins. I think their revealed preferences, they will migrate towards it when it's being recommended to them. But if you were to ask them, do you want to be angry all the time? Do you want to be, cordoned off from your community? Like, are these the things that you want? Is this the media system that you want? They would answer it differently. And so we don't have a competitor, a viable competitor, given network effects and all of that, that can provide that for them. If I can ask Professor Fukuyama, I don't understand how your proposal differs from interoperability, because isn't that what interoperability does, is that it would open up, it would have an open API so that these curation systems could come in?
Yeah, I think that our system is just a lot easier to use, right? The interoperability scenario is that you don't like the way that Facebook is giving you your news feed, so you take yourself and your data to another platform. And I just think as a technical matter, that's pretty difficult because there's just such a heterogeneity of, especially in the metadata, that's really what's useful to these platforms. You can't just take your Facebook feed and take it to Twitter or take it to some new competitor. With Facebook in particular, you've got these huge privacy problems because a lot of what you see in your feed is dependent on your circle of friends, and by the terms of use, you got to get their permission, if you're going to export any of their data anywhere else. And so for that reason, I just haven't seen the interoperability crowd come up with a plausible mechanism that would make it easy, if you didn't like a particular problem, to move elsewhere. Whereas, at least our middleware thing, all you do is click a button and you kind of see an alternative way of, arranging the news you see. By the way, this also works for search. I didn't have that demo, but we also have a version of we have a demo for middleware that would alter the ordering of search results, because that's been shown to have a major impact on the way people. Well, it gets to the question of Yandex, right? If you're searching, what's going on in the Russian special military operation, it makes a great deal of difference whether it's Google or Yandex that you're searching on, and you can actually design a middleware recommendation system where you could tailor that so that the items that pop up at the top of your list are ones that are based on a rule that you choose.
Eric, I want to come back to you if I can. We hear this concern all the time that this is an inherently partisan issue. Different people want different things. Isn't that the point of democracy? Is we all get together and figure out what the rules should be, and we don't necessarily agree, but we need rules and we make them. Why is that such a concern to you?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. Yes, partisanship has been an integral part of our country since the founding. But I think, at least my observation is, I'd like to think that many of us would agree that we've seen reduced efforts at bipartisan cooperation. So we're not seeing the efforts to try to come together. What we're seeing is in situations where one party has power, they take advantage of that power. And certainly we've seen, when it comes to speech regulation, that each party wants to engage in their own form of censorship. They don't agree on what it is, but if they can control the outcome, they will pursue their pro-censorship agenda without trying to be partisan at all. They'll just say, we got the power, we're going to deploy it, and we're going to control how the conversation takes place thereafter because we've been able to put our imprint on it. So I don't think I understood your question, because I don't see a lot of bipartisanship today. And the idea is to use the partisanship to control how the future will play out.
I don't think I said bipartisanship was the measure, but Ellen wanted to get in.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such an interesting problem because part of the reason I think that it's gotten worse is because of the systems that we're talking about, and because the sort of performative aspect of social media, the reward structure, the trolling has just spilled out into the world. I mean, that's what DeSantis is doing, right? He's just doing in the real world what people do on social media. That is what he's rewarded for. I take your point that we have to be very careful and always think about how these things can be abused. But, the IRS can and has been abused. I mean, the Department of Transportation, every single, to your point, every single agency that we have, this is basically the libertarian argument against any kind of regulation because it's subject to rent seeking and can be abused. So I think it is possible to and this is why I think it's a good idea to sort of abstract out of this very most contentious and politically divided space to algorithmic systems more generally, because there I think there's more possibility for bipartisan agreement that, nobody wants to be subject to the whims of inscrutable AI.
Sorry, can I just add one thing about that? I think it's a popular meme that it's algorithmic amplification that's causing the divides that lead to things like the partisan grandstanding. I would point to those who haven't seen it, the book by Yochai Benkler and his team, Network Propaganda, that talked about actually the injection of the misinformation or the distortion comes at the layer of broadcasting, like Fox News, and then it continues to play out online. But one possibility is if that book is correct, then fixing all the algorithmic amplification won't actually fix any problem, because the real grandstanding is taking place for the broadcasting audience.
Do you think it would help to have more transparency around the algorithms?
Oh, I mean, hugely, for a variety of reasons. I mean, one is, it's just we're looking through such a narrow little hole in something that's been chipped out by Julie Angwin and Frances Haugen and whoever else has managed to go in and grab nuggets, to mix my metaphors. So I mean, just to not be living in that world would be an improvement. And to the point that Ellen just brought up, I think it would be, like procedural fairness is kind of an appreciated dynamic here, in part because it's just Republicans who are usually complaining about it, but that doesn't mean, folks, that they're wrong. And transparency into not just transparency, but pivoting to actually requiring some forms of process for users, I think could also improve the perceived legitimacy of how these platforms operate. I also would just love to respond to something that Frank said about interoperability being impossible.
Not impossible, just difficult.
Yeah, we have to stipulate that everything anybody in this room wants to do is 1% chance of happening. I mean, we heard you can't trust judges, Congress can't legislate, agencies can't enforce, and interoperability is hard. So let's stipulate. But maybe if we make all the arguments, one of them will happen. And I think interoperability and data portability is super important. I'm not technically skilled enough to really make the thick argument for why it can happen. I'll just point out, something Dina has written about is, early in Facebook's history, you could migrate your MySpace social graph to Facebook, but you couldn't but then Facebook had the brilliant idea, what if we make sure that you cannot take your data from Facebook out to MySpace? So I think when it comes to portability and interoperability, maybe it's the case that you can't make it so for everything that you've got on a platform that you use, but I suspect that it's possible to identify the most important things, like your friends list, like your DMs, and make it, and mandate portability of those things. And maybe even mandate simple forms of interoperability, right? There are some that are more technically challenging, and there are some that are less technically challenging.
Well, the DSA is mandating
yeah,
it, so I hope it works.
Can I point out, we actually do have data portability mandates in the California Consumer Privacy Act and in a number of the copy laws, and I question whether or not we have any empirics that those have solved any problem.
By the way, if Daphne Keller were on this panel still and not stuck in a hotel quarantining, she would say that actually the Facebook friends list is the last thing that you could actually port because of the privacy rules.
All right, I want to open this up to questions from the audience now. Get some other people involved, yeah? Zafria, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for this great panel. So I just want a little more discussion about banning targeted advertising. And I don't want, glad you've written about it.
Interesting idea.
Yes, such an interesting idea. Somebody in Wired wrote about it in 2020. No, but I want to, as Luigi would say, you can be queen. So don't tell me why politically it wouldn't happen. What do you think it would make a significant difference if you banned the business model either by banning targeted advertising or by banning advertising as a legitimate business model for this particular industry. And of course, this is something that we do regularly, is say certain kinds of business models don't work in particular arenas.
So a bad thing about my job is that I spend a lot of time thinking really hard about something, and then I move on to the next thing and forget about that. So I wish you'd... Yeah, okay, right, sure, yeah. But you might understand something for 5 years, and I understand it for 5 months. So, I mean, yes, I think that let's define targeted advertising. I mean, I like the catchy surveillance advertising frame that's popped up for this. We know that, we're defining it as advertising that is personalized, that is targeted to individuals based on data that is gathered about their browsing habits, their location, any number of a zillion other things, and usually within that you have to distinguish between cross-context behavioral advertising, where Facebook doesn't actually just, as everyone here knows by now, I hope, is not just watching you when you're on Facebook. It's actually got a cookie on every website on the internet, pretty much. Google definitely does, and so unless you take steps to block that, they're using data gathered in many different contexts and using that to target ads to you when you're using their services, or in the case of Google, just everywhere. This business model is what makes Google and Facebook. Well, Google makes a lot of its money from search advertising, which does not require this at all. It's certainly it's 99% of Meta Corporation Unlimited's income. And it drives a lot of the pathologies, or at least it worsens a lot of the pathologies that we're talking about here, because it's, I don't want to say invents the incentive to get people's attention, because we all want attention. We all want people's attention, but it does seem like a particularly raw form of that. The more attention people are paying you, the more, first the more ads you're showing them, but second, the more data that you're gleaning from them. And it just leads to all kinds of non-speech related negative societal consequences that flow from just this incredibly vast private sector surveillance state. And so you have to, Stephen, and I'm probably making him want to have a stroke right now, because with the next thing I say, which is you really have to question what we're getting from that. And he would say a lot, and I would say not that much. I'm not sure though, Zephyr, where I am on there was a moment where I was like, this is the thing, this is the silver bullet. If you wipe this out, then all the content stuff that we're talking about goes away. I don't know where I'm at on that.
It's interesting, in mainstream journalism, it is sort of accepted that the presence of a third party in the relationship between the consumer and the producer is a factor that tends to moderate the content. And it's interesting that in the internet context...
Moderate meaning change?
To change and to move toward the center, right? And in the internet context, it's interesting that the premise is the opposite, that this is a radicalizing variable. Did anyone else want to jump in on that? Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
I will point out to the cross-context advertising, that will be regulated by the California Privacy Rights Act that will be going into effect in 2023. So we may see some changes already because of that. And I won't take the cheat of pointing out that there are going to be constitutional restrictions on the ability to limit or eliminate targeted advertising, but there are, and we shouldn't ignore those. I guess the question is it really what you want? And let me explain what I mean by that. So the less that publishers can rely upon advertising, the most likely move they make is that they then set up paywalls. And they create walled gardens that you have to pay to access, and consider the distributional effects of that. As we move towards an environment where we get less content for free, more that we pay for, those of us who are privileged enough to be able to pay for it think no big deal. But those who aren't as privileged get a very different information ecosystem that leads to potentially reifying all the existing power structures that we already have. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And so I'm not in love with targeted advertising per se, but I do ask the question, if you made progress on that, would you like the outcome at the end if it leads to paywalls that reinforce power structures?
The implication of that is that targeted advertising has helped publications make money, but the opposite has been true. It's triggered a dramatic transfer of wealth from news gathering organizations to the platforms that sit on top or underneath, or whichever way the stack goes, these systems. Banning advertising wholesale, I think, now we're talking. I mean, there's an alternative to targeted advertising. It used to just be called advertising. Now it has to be retro-named contextual advertising to distinguish it from personally micro-targeted advertising. And all it means is that you buy an ad based on the thing that the person's reading or the thing that it's looking at, and it works pretty well.
But that all gets the definition of what is banned or restricted by targeted advertising. And some of the drafts I've seen would eliminate much, if not all, of the advertising today.
Yeah, I mean, stipulate that any suggestion we have, there's a dumb version of it that has been advanced.
Assume that's the version we're going to see in this environment, please.
Not if I'm queen for a day.
Okay. I will be happy to be subject to your rule.
Do you want to?
Somebody in this room could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that GDPR already bans the use of data generated in one market to market to another sector, and that it's been very, very difficult to enforce that, if not impossible.
Yeah. Questions? Yeah.
Well, it's been difficult. Just a second. Sorry, just 1 second. Sorry. I can't let that comment go uncommented. Because there is a presumption against GDPR, which is diffused in the United States. The GDPR is excellent law. It's
No,
just
I like GDPR. I'm just saying it's been hard to enforce that provision.
Yes, because the design of the institutional design, which has been put in place for enforcement, hasn't been conducive.
Yeah.
But yes, you're right. The GDPR completely determines that processing purposes need to be absolutely pursued one by one. And if that were enforced, would be possibly not even needing to ban advertising in the way discussed, although I'm in favor of it.
All right, other questions from the room?
So this is an antitrust conference in the beginning, in the idea, and the antitrust, the basic notion is that depending on your power, you have different responsibility. And in speech, most of it, at least Section 230, has been applied across the board, single rules, and finally in Europe, I think, not finally, but like in Europe, we are starting to move towards a system where you're going to have different layers of rules depending on your market share, things like this. So I wanted to ask all the panelists if you think this is both like legally feasible and if this would be desirable in the US as well, depending on the system that you have.
Ellen, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I do think most of the draft legislation that is stuck does that. It sort of has a VLOP version of very large online platforms, and I do think that makes sense. Can I just say one thing about the advertising? Because I think this is such a central point that for better or for worse, advertisers have played a role in media, in traditional media. And I don't think they play much of a role because they don't know very much in the online space about what they're supporting and who sees their, and that's because of the ad tech monopoly. And so I think part of the transparency, the benefit of transparency, so I think, Frank, you're right, that transparency in a vacuum doesn't do anything. You need to have actionable opportunities for action. And one of the stakeholders here, I think, are the advertisers, and they have not exerted very much agency, and partly because they don't, whether we have micro-targeted ads or not, they don't know what they're supporting.
Can I go back to the question about making rules based on company size? I do also have a paper on that that explains, I think, some of the challenges of doing so. Again, you really have to look at the mechanics of that. There are different dimensions in which you can measure size. You can measure based on revenue. You can measure based on employees. You can measure based on traffic, of which there are multiple measures. And each of them has pros and cons that really need to be thought out. There are things that are very obvious low-hanging fruit that don't show up in these regulations. Things like a phase-in period. If you don't put in a phase-in period, then you have to comply with the rule before you've actually triggered the rule, even if you never get there. So there's like some low-hanging fruit that needs to be addressed when doing that. I think that there's some bigger structural problems, which is if it's a good idea, it should be universal, right? If there's a merit to the policy idea, it should be universal. And so you really have to then say there's a reason why it's not universal, why we're giving a privilege or imposing a detriment onto a company based on its size. And I think that there can be pro-competitive effects if you can lower barriers to entry, But then what you're really saying is there's a good idea, we just don't think it should apply to the smaller companies. And that just is weird to me. I think that you really need to examine it. I will also point out that this can be a basis of constitutional infirmity. And in fact, the Florida law was struck down in part because of the fact that it made a distinction between larger and smaller companies, because then there needs to be a justification. Why are you making a distinction between the two? And Florida had no good reason for doing so, other than they really hate big companies. Last thing I'll point out, for those of you who've been tracking the antitrust proposals in Congress, they were really, really, really hoping to get Facebook. They set a hard revenue threshold, and then market cap threshold, and then Facebook went under that market cap threshold. So the whole goal was to get Facebook, but the regulation wasn't designed to actually accomplish that. We also saw Netflix just get walloped on its market cap. These things are volatile, and the volatility then raises the question, is it really about the measure that's being picked? Is that really the proxy for the problem that you're trying to address?
All right, other questions?
Hi, I'm Gus. I'm with Omidyar Network. Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you
We
speak up?
cannot hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
The mic's live, I just couldn't hear you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Gus. Thank you for the panel. That's not technically what the legislation that is proposed in the Senate does. It actually is like the criteria is multi-year. So in this particular moment of time, Facebook wouldn't fit, but in the other variables, it would. So it's true that it's hard to write legislation in a way that captures specific narrow companies, but that's not a reason not to try it. And I think that in the case of legislation we have at hand in the Senate and in the House, that would be achieved. I also think that going back to Filippo's point of like, well, how does antitrust fit out of this? Like, I wonder if like, for example, one thing that antitrust can do, potentially being a bit creative, is to challenge acquisitions from companies that are trying to make it harder to understand how a market functions, right? Like, for example, when Facebook bought CrowdTangle, the only company that would allow you to have any kind of like metrics on what's going on inside the platform, a more creative antitrust regulator could have said, like, you know what, maybe that's not the right idea, that's bad for the marketplace and bad for consumers. When Facebook, Dina Sirabasen's theory on privacy also applies to content. As Facebook consolidated its market power, the quality of its product, the toxicity of its network became worse. A creative antitrust regulator could say, like, you know what, that's also a bad idea, we should not allow that to happen. I wonder if like you've thought about as well ways in which, I'm saying this because like unfortunately, I think it was Fiona's point in the previous panel, we cannot assume that Congress will legislate, unfortunately, in this country, but we do have antitrust enforcers with some power and some creativity and some political will, which is new, and we have maybe the chance of having legislation antitrust passing. Have you thought about how those tools could be used to tackle these problems without having to assume that we will be able to reform Section 230 or pass more content narrow rules?
Anyone want to take that?
Well, so the answer is no, because I don't do antitrust. But I will sort of answer it in an orthogonal way, which is, so if we can't get any kind of legislation, I do think there are powers of enforcement that can get at some of these problems outside of antitrust, which are consumer protection. And so, there are ways in which the platforms, Juliet made this point yesterday, right? Like, the platforms say they're going to do this, and then we investigate it, and then we find that they're not doing that. Well, that's a consumer protection problem, right? And so, I think, but I'll leave it for, I don't know, Eric, if you've thought about the antitrust possibilities here.
No, I just want to point out again, if you aren't paying attention, the Florida law that I mentioned that regulated content moderation also created basically an antitrust block list that blocked the state from engaging in transactions with basically the disfavored companies. And again, this is all transparently partisan. And so to think that antitrust will avoid those partisan problems, you look at what a state like Florida is doing, and it should make you really nervous that in fact the antitrust is just another tool. You say, hey, let's do antitrust enforcement. The Florida legislature said, that's great. We've got a great idea of how to get them.
Hello, yeah, I'm Sam. I just have two questions. The first one is, in the last, I think, 3 years, we haven't seen a major new social media company come up after TikTok. So my question is, do you think we've reached saturation in the big tech space, or is it just that? That's the first question. Do you think we've reached saturation? The second question is informed by the discussion about advertising. And this brings me to Facebook's attempt to start a currency, a digital currency called Libra. I think it started, and then there was talk about it, and then it collapsed, and then Facebook called itself Meta. However, if you look at some of the reasons that Facebook perhaps was thinking about this, was that the advertising revenues were not growing as fast in the markets where they were having membership grow, places like Asia and Africa. Most of the advertising was in the US where membership was going down. So one of the hypothesized reasons was that they were trying to monetize places like Asia and Africa where numbers were really going up, which brings into question if they were able to hypothetically go ahead with this Libra and have their own monetary policy, what would be the impact of, say, deplatforming somebody in that kind of space? Yeah, just two thoughts. Your reactions, your thoughts. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the international context here too, because that is really important. I mean, like, I totally agree with what Ellen said. So I'll get back to the money thing, but just going back to what Ellen said about Section 230 being sort of tangential to most of the things we're discussing, I think that's true here. And I don't think it's true globally, because we've learned that Facebook, not that Facebook is the sum total of this discussion, but Facebook in particular just plunges into developing countries without any language capacity or employees or really any ability to enforce its own rules. And the stuff that happens in some of those countries using Facebook and Instagram truly shocks the conscience. And there's plenty of actual incitement to violence and other things that actually are illegal, and that a company that of course you can't enforce a judgment against the company for, and people have tried, including in Myanmar, because you have to get an American court to enforce that judgment. So that's just one reason I'm glad you brought up the international context. And then to your point about, yeah, Facebook had a sort of hermetically sealed financial system, it would strengthen its claim to being an essential service that it's unjust to deny anybody of, which would kind of cut both ways, because it would make its own actions subject to more scrutiny, because it would be acting sort of like as a quasi-governmental entity, which you might say that it already does. And this isn't even really that hypothetical, because there are countries where Facebook just is the internet. Where it's gone, developing countries where people don't have a lot of internet access, Facebook has had this strategy of just going in to get more people into its ecosystem of basically providing Facebook Basics, which is like, here's the internet as mediated by Facebook. So in some ways, I think what you're describing already exists.
If I could just add to that, Facebook revealed at one point that 80% of its content moderation dollars were going into American content moderation, which means that the other 20% was for all the other 180 countries in the world.
They didn't reveal it. It was revealed for them.
Yeah.
If I can just respond to the saturation question, I really doubt it. I mean, my understanding is that there's no VC money for anyone to do social, because there's no opportunity for entry. And on the, coming back, Gus, to the antitrust question, which I can't answer as a matter of novel antitrust standards, but the way I look at this is more as a media lawyer, and so there's always been in the media space ex-ante ownership restrictions that were more responsive to these democratic concerns, right? That were more generous or more strict, depending on how you look at it, than the antitrust standards. And also, I think, to the point about the currency, that had structural separations between different kinds of businesses, which were always a concern, but even more now, because it's not just the deplatforming power, it's the data collection power that comes from having the currency.
Wait.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to pick up on the Section 230 question. And from the platforms, we seem to hear that something like repeal of 230 would force a wholesale change in their way of operating. So I guess I'm wondering if that's true, how can it be a distraction? It seems like we would see a change, and it could be good and it could be bad, but something would have to change. So I'm wondering how it can be, a distraction. It seems like it would be a catalyst for a different way of running these platforms.
Oh, so all I meant, yes, no, I think it would affect a huge change in that they would be much more censorious, or they would go to the other side and just become spam-filled and not do any moderation, depending on how the Section 230 modification were written. I just don't think it would help that much with the problems that we're seeing, because ultimately, if they're reacting to a fear of liability, you have to look at what the underlying liability would be for. And, yes, there would be some defamation, but there just is no liability. They are off the hook entirely, with or without Section 230, for hate speech and disinformation, because it's not illegal in this country. I mean, the online harms that the DSAs, if you read the DSA, they have this whole category of illegal speech, which just doesn't exist in the US. So I think it would affect change in terms of the platform operations. I just don't think we'd get much out of it in terms of harm reduction.
We're running out of time, but does anybody want to talk about Elon Musk and Twitter and the question of whether the ownership of these entities matter? Personally, it seems to me that, Mark Zuckerberg already owns Facebook, so I'm not sure how Elon Musk joining the club makes things worse, but...
Well, this is what I was mentioning Twitter earlier. This is my... So you're exactly right. But it's not like people who are worried about Elon Musk buying Twitter think it's great that Mark Zuckerberg has unilateral control over Meta. So that's a bit of a... Yeah, that's also bad. My reaction to this is that it just should be a wake-up call. Just jolt us into awareness a little bit that, wow, sure do just voluntarily give this thing, or collectively give this platform that may be being bought by Elon Musk and may not, a whole lot of power here. It's like, it's as if all the journalists and politics people and whatever and academics were all just like every night gathered at the same bar. Like that's where you'd go if you wanted to influence those people, and Twitter is that bar. But the nice thing is that I really don't think it has to be. The outgoing executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, recently sent this memo to his staff saying, spend less time on Twitter, but more importantly, you don't have to be on Twitter. So within the journalism profession, there is kind of a sense that you gotta be there. Because you gotta, you need to be promoting. You need to be promoting your own stuff. And a lot of people, I'll share with you, within Wired, some people are like, oh, how dare the New York Times be so, do this to people. And I was like, this is great. This is a collective action problem. I'm not deleting my account, but if it's not that, there's just not that many people you have to get to. So I think it needs to come from on high, and different institutional norms within media would help take the temperature down and make Twitter less of a piece of essential political infrastructure, so that if Elon Musk wants to buy it, go crazy, it doesn't matter.
All right, we've got a 12 p.m. hard stop, so thank you all very much. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.